The unlikely encounter. Zack had never been to a place like this before. He had traveled across the stars, seen strange planets and alien species, but nothing compared to the vast alien space station in front of him. It was massive, towering in the distance, its sleek surface shimmering under the light of distant stars. The humans had only recently started exploring space, and Zack was one of the pioneers sent on an important mission. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side, but he had a sense of unease. The journey had been long, and Zack was exhausted. He had spent days in a small, cramped ship, battling space turbulence and endless boredom. Now his feet were firmly planted on the foreign soil of an alien planet, and he felt a sense of relief, until he remembered that his mission wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. He had to meet with the aliens at the space station, negotiate, and do whatever was necessary to further humanity's cause. Simple, right? As he made his way toward the entrance of the station, his boots clicking against the smooth, metallic ground, Zack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The space station looked pristine, but there was an eerie silence. The air felt still, as though the whole place was holding its breath. Zack tried to push aside his doubts. He was here to do a job, and he wouldn't let anything get in his way. When he entered the station's lobby, the doors slid open without a sound. He was immediately greeted by a strange, mechanical voice, announcing his arrival in a language he couldn't understand. He could only assume it was a welcoming message, though he had no way of knowing for sure. Alien technology was far more advanced than anything humans had at their disposal. The lobby was large, filled with high-tech displays and strange, floating holograms. The walls were lined with alien art, some of it pulsating with light. Zack felt a bit out of place, his worn-out spacesuit looking shabby compared to the futuristic surroundings. He could feel eyes on him, though no one seemed to be watching directly. He walked up to a desk in the center of the room. Behind it sat the receptionist. Her features were hard to make out, as her skin was a strange shade of green, her face slightly elongated with two glowing eyes that seemed to peer into his very soul. Zack didn't know what to expect, but he certainly didn't expect this. "Greetings," she said, her voice calm and robotic. "Welcome to the Zorvan 5 space station. How may I assist you today?" Zack blinked, momentarily taken aback. He had expected a lot of things from the aliens, serious negotiations, perhaps a military officer to guide him. But not this. A receptionist. He thought that was a job for humans. But he quickly reminded himself that these aliens were far beyond humanity, and they probably did everything in their own way. "I'm here on official business," Zack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm here to speak with your leaders. It's a matter of great importance." The receptionist looked him up and down, her glowing eyes never leaving him. For a moment, Zack thought she was going to ignore him or make him wait for hours, but instead, she simply raised one of her slim fingers to the control panel in front of her. She tapped a few buttons, and a small screen popped up, showing a map of the station. "Please wait here," she said flatly. "Your meeting will be scheduled shortly. If you require anything, I am here to assist." Zack was about to protest. He hadn't traveled all this way to be dismissed by an alien receptionist, but something in her tone told him it would be pointless to argue. Besides, he didn't have much choice. He needed to stay on their good side. He'd heard rumors that the Zorvans, the race that controlled this space station, were notoriously difficult to deal with. If he didn't want things to go sideways, he had to play their game. As Zack took a step back, he noticed the receptionist's eyes seemed to glow even brighter for a moment, as though she were scanning him, judging him. Zack wasn't sure why, but the way she looked at him made him feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable he felt. The station was quiet, almost too quiet. No one else seemed to be around, despite the signs of high activity in the building. He could see screens flickering, alien drones moving silently through the halls, and yet there was no one else in sight. He felt like he was being watched from every corner. Suddenly, Zach's patience started to wear thin. His mission was too important to be delayed like this. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "I'm sorry, but can you tell me what's going on here?" Zach asked, his voice growing a little more forceful. "I've been waiting long enough. I'm not just some tourist passing through. I have an urgent matter to attend to." The receptionist didn't flinch. Her expression remained as unreadable as ever. She gave a small, dismissive nod and tapped a few more buttons on her console. "Please wait," she repeated, her voice still flat and emotionless. Zach stared at her, his frustration growing. He had no idea why, but something about her manner, her complete lack of urgency, made him feel as though he didn't matter at all. It was as if his mission, his purpose, meant nothing to her. The Zorvans had always been known for their arrogance, but this was something else. It was almost as if they were toying with him. Suspense. Zach knew he couldn't stand here forever. He had to figure out what was going on. This was no ordinary space station, and this was no ordinary receptionist. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. But what was it? Was it just his imagination? Or was he about to find out that this mission was far more complicated and dangerous than he ever thought? The rising tension. Zach couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As he waited, staring at the cold, indifferent receptionist, the seconds stretched on like minutes. Every passing moment made the silence more unnerving. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. Why had they brought him here? Why were they treating him like a nobody? There had to be more to this mission than he had been told. He glanced around the room again, his eyes narrowing. The alien technology embedded in the walls was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. Screens flickered with unreadable symbols, while strange devices hummed softly in the background. But none of that mattered. What mattered now was that he was being ignored. His mission could not wait. Zach's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden whir of a door opening nearby. Another alien entered the room. This one was different, taller, with sharp features and skin that shimmered like liquid metal. It didn't seem to pay any attention to Zach as it walked past him and toward the receptionist. The receptionist, Visa as the screen identified her earlier, didn't even glance up as the alien approached. She simply continued tapping away at the controls on her desk. Zach frowned. This wasn't right. No one, no matter how important they were, should be ignored like this. Feeling a surge of frustration, Zach decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He straightened up, his military training kicking in. He wasn't just going to sit here and be treated like this. He needed to find answers. He needed to find out why he was here and what was really going on. "I've had enough," Zach muttered under his breath. He wasn't going to let this alien receptionist dismiss him. He approached the desk, his boots clanging on the metal floor with each determined step. The alien in the room glanced at him, but its expression didn't change. It was as if Zach wasn't even there. "Excuse me," Zach said, his voice sharp. "I'm not here to be ignored. I'm here on an important mission, and I need to speak to someone in charge." Visa didn't even flinch. She just kept tapping at the screen in front of her, as if she hadn't heard a word Zach had said. Zach's patience wore thin. His hand shot out and slammed onto the desk, making the entire surface vibrate. The noise echoed through the room, louder than he intended. This time, Visa finally looked up, her glowing eyes narrowing in annoyance. "You will wait, human," she said, her voice cold and disinterested. "Your meeting will be scheduled." Zach's pulse quickened. The dismissive tone in her voice made his blood boil. He was no longer just an outsider in this strange place. He was being treated like an inconvenience. His temper flared, but he kept his composure. If he didn't get answers now, who knew when he would? He clenched his fists, trying to control his anger. "I don't care about your protocols or whatever system you have here. I need to speak with someone in charge. Now." For the first time, Visa's expression flickered, just for a moment, a flash of something unreadable in her glowing eyes. But it was gone before Zach could interpret it. She sighed dramatically, her fingers still dancing across the console. "Very well," she said. "You will be escorted to the briefing room. Wait here." Without another word, she pressed a button on her desk. Immediately, a hidden door slid open to the side, revealing a hallway that led deeper into the station. Zach stood there for a moment, staring at the door. He didn't trust Visa, but he had no choice. If he was going to get the answers he needed, he had to follow her instructions. As he walked toward the door, a strange feeling washed over him. The hallway was dimly lit, and the walls seemed to close in as he moved. The silence was overwhelming, like the station itself was watching him. It felt like every footstep echoed through the long corridor, too loud in the otherwise still atmosphere. Zach tried to shake the unsettling feeling, but it stuck with him. Every corner he turned, every shadow in the hall seemed to be hiding something. It wasn't just the station that felt wrong. It was everything. The way the aliens moved so effortlessly through the space, the way they seemed to pay him no mind, and especially the way Visa had treated him, it all felt off. He continued down the hall, his hand brushing against the cold walls. The further he went, the more the weight of the silence pressed in on him. He was used to missions that required quick action and clear communication, but here there was only the strange hum of alien machinery and the occasional soft sound of footsteps. Finally, he reached the end of the hallway, where another door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, a small room was lit by a glowing greenish light. A table sat in the center, surrounded by strange chairs that seemed to be designed for beings much taller than humans. Zach walked into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. There were no aliens waiting for him, no leaders to meet with, just empty seats and the eerie glow of the lights. As he stood there, unsure of what to do next, the door slammed shut behind him. The lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. Suspense. Zach felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Something was wrong. This wasn't the briefing room. This was something else, something far more sinister. And before he could react, the door opened again, and he heard a voice that made his blood run cold. "We've been expecting you, human." Zach spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but the figure in the doorway was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The alien that stood there had eyes glowing bright red, its face expressionless. Its mere presence filled the room with an unnatural chill. Twist. Zach realized, in that moment, he was no longer just a visitor. He was a prisoner. The hidden agenda. Zach's heart pounded in his chest as the alien in the doorway stepped forward. The door slid shut behind him, trapping Zach in the dimly lit room. The atmosphere felt suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on him. His hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but then he hesitated. This alien was unlike any he had encountered before. Its form was taller and more imposing than the others, and its eyes glowed an eerie shade of red, giving it a menacing, almost predatory appearance. "Who are you?" Zach asked, his voice steady, despite the unease rising within him. "What's going on here?" The alien didn't answer immediately. It merely stood there, watching Zach with cold, calculating eyes, as if studying him. For a moment, it seemed like the alien wasn't going to speak at all. Then, without any warning, it began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. "We are the Zorvans," the alien said, its voice deep and resonant, with an unshakable calm. "We have been watching humans for a long time." Zach felt a chill run down his spine. The Zorvans. He had heard of them before. A highly advanced alien race known for their intelligence and their ruthless ways. They had remained largely hidden from humanity until now, but rumors had spread of their manipulative tactics and the dark experiments they conducted. This wasn't good. Not good at all. "What do you want with me?" Zach demanded, trying to keep his fear under control. He had been trained for moments like this, but even he wasn't sure what kind of game the Zorvans were playing. The alien tilted its head slightly, as if considering Zack's question. You are here because we brought you here, human. You are part of something much larger than you can comprehend. Zack's mind raced, his thoughts swirling with confusion and suspicion. Brought here. He had thought he was on an important diplomatic mission, but now everything felt wrong. He had never been part of any plan to be brought here. He had simply been sent to negotiate, or so he had thought. I'm not part of any plan, Zack said firmly, his hand still hovering near the side of his suit where his weapon was holstered. I'm just here to speak with your leaders. I demand an explanation. The alien's eyes gleamed with a strange amusement, as if Zack's words were nothing more than a passing curiosity. You are here because you are a test. You see, human, the Zorvans are tired of waiting. We have waited centuries to make our move, and now it is time. We will be the rulers of this galaxy, and you, along with your kind, will be our first subjects. Zack's blood ran cold. Subjects. He had known something was wrong, but he hadn't imagined this, an alien race bent on total domination. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the truth was even darker than he had feared. What are you talking about? Zack asked, his voice barely a whisper, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in. You can't possibly expect humans to just accept that. The alien let out a low, eerie laugh that made Zack's skin crawl. We do not expect you to accept it. We expect you to be tested, just like all the others. And you, human, will be the first of your kind to face the trial. Zack felt a pit form in his stomach. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission. This wasn't about peaceful negotiation. The Zorvans had no intention of making peace. They wanted to dominate, control, and conquer. What kind of trial? Zack asked, his voice now trembling despite his best efforts. That you will learn in due time, the Zorvan said cryptically, its gaze narrowing. But for now, you will meet the one who is truly in charge here. With that, the alien turned and motioned for Zack to follow. Zack hesitated for only a moment before he realized he had no choice. If he didn't follow, he would likely be locked in this room, left to rot while the Zorvans carried out their plans. He had to stay in the game. He had to find a way out of this. He followed the alien down the corridor, the walls seemingly closing in around him as they walked. The silence was suffocating. The air felt thick, and every step he took made him feel like he was sinking deeper into an unknown trap. Every few steps, the Zorvan would glance over its shoulder, its glowing red eyes making Zack feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. They passed through several more corridors, each one more intricate and alien than the last. The Zorvans seemed to know every inch of the station, moving with purpose and confidence. Zack could barely keep up, his mind still racing with questions. What kind of test did they have in mind for him? What were they really planning? Finally, they arrived at a large, heavily guarded door. Two more Zorvans stood at attention, their eyes cold and unblinking. The alien Zack had been following stopped in front of the door, gesturing for Zack to enter. This is where you will meet the true leader of the Zorvans, the alien said, its voice betraying no emotion. Prepare yourself. You may not like what you hear. Zack took a deep breath, his pulse quickening. He had no idea what lay beyond that door, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't going to be good. He had been led into a trap, and now he had to figure out how to escape. The Zorvan pressed a button on the side of the door, and it slid open with a quiet hiss. On the other side, the room was vast, with walls that seemed to stretch on forever. In the center stood a large, imposing figure, the leader of the Zorvans. It was unlike any alien Zack had ever seen. The leader was enormous, its skin black and metallic, with eyes that glowed a brilliant gold. It was surrounded by holographic displays, as if it were constantly calculating and planning. The Zorvan leader looked down at Zack, its expression unreadable. For the first time since he had arrived, Zack felt truly small. The weight of the leader's gaze was enough to make his legs feel weak. "You are the first human to face the Zorvan judgment," the leader said in a deep, booming voice. "You will either prove your worth, or you will fall like all the others before you." The test of survival. Zack stood frozen, staring at the towering figure of the Zorvan leader. His mind raced as the weight of the situation began to settle in. This was no ordinary mission. He wasn't here to negotiate or broker peace. He was part of a test, a twisted game orchestrated by an alien species bent on dominating humanity. The leader's golden eyes glinted with an unsettling calmness, as if it already knew what Zack was thinking. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in around him, and Zack could feel every inch of the space pressing down on him. There was no way out of here, no way to escape. "You will either prove yourself human, or you will fail like all the others who came before you," the leader repeated, its voice low and rumbling, almost as if it were speaking through the very core of the station. Zack clenched his fists, trying to steady his nerves. He had faced worse, much worse, during his time in the military. But this was something entirely different. The Zorvans were no ordinary adversaries. Their advanced technology, their cold calculation, it was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. "How do I prove myself?" Zack asked, forcing the words out of his mouth. He wasn't going to show weakness. He had to keep his cool if he was going to survive. The Zorvan leader's lips curled into a slow, almost predatory smile. "You will face our challenge. Your skills, your intelligence, your will to survive, all will be tested. If you succeed, you will have earned your place among us. If you fail, you will become another footnote in our history." Zack's stomach churned. This wasn't a simple test. It wasn't just about surviving a few challenges or passing a set of tasks. The Zorvans were playing a game with much higher stakes than that. They were testing his very essence, his will to fight, his ability to adapt, and perhaps most terrifying of all, his ability to withstand the unimaginable. Before Zack could respond, the ground beneath his feet began to rumble. He felt the vibrations travel up through the soles of his boots, sending a jolt of alarm through his body. The chamber around him seemed to shift, the walls folding in on themselves, until the room transformed into something entirely different. The Zorvan leader's voice echoed through the chamber. "The trial begins now." Suddenly, the floor beneath Zack gave way. He plunged downward, his heart racing as the world seemed to drop out from under him. He tried to brace himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The air rushed past him, and his stomach churned with the terrifying sense of freefall. For a moment, he had no idea how far he had fallen. But then, with a sudden jolt, he slammed into the ground. Zack groaned as he pushed himself up. The fall had taken him into a new chamber, one that was far more menacing than the last. This new environment was dark, the only light coming from faintly glowing symbols carved into the walls. The air was thick and heavy, and the sound of his own breathing seemed to echo back at him, as if the very walls were alive and watching. The walls of the chamber began to shift again. A door slid open on the far side, and from it emerged a series of strange, insect-like creatures. Their bodies were armored, and they clicked and hissed as they advanced toward Zack. These weren't just any ordinary creatures. They were genetically engineered for combat, created by the Zorvans as part of the trial. Zack could already feel the sweat forming on his brow. He had been through countless battles, but these things, whatever they were unlike any enemies he had ever faced. He reached for his weapon, but then he remembered. This wasn't a mission where his gun would solve everything. The Zorvans wanted to test him, not just his ability to shoot. This was a test of survival, of intelligence, and of willpower. The creatures drew closer, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. Zack's military training kicked in as he quickly analyzed the situation. The creatures moved in sync, working together like a well-oiled machine. He had to be faster than them. He had to be smarter. Zack darted to the side, narrowly avoiding a swipe from one of the creature's sharp claws. It hissed in frustration, turning toward him. Zack didn't hesitate. He rolled to the side, using the terrain to his advantage. The creatures weren't as quick as he was. They moved with precision, but they lacked the agility he had learned over years of combat. He lunged toward one of the creatures, knocking it off balance and slamming it into the wall. It let out an ear-piercing screech as it collapsed to the ground. Zack didn't stop to admire his work. He knew there were more of them, and they were getting closer. The remaining creatures charged at him, their movements quick and coordinated. Zack had only seconds to think. He needed a way out, a way to escape this deadly game. As one of the creatures lunged at him, Zack ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding its deadly claws. He grabbed a piece of metal from the floor, a jagged piece of scrap from the chamber's shifting walls. With a quick, fluid motion, he used it to stab the creature in its exposed underbelly. It screeched in pain, its body writhing in agony. Zack pulled the makeshift weapon free and turned to face the others. The remaining creatures hesitated for a moment, sensing their comrades' defeat. But they didn't retreat. No, they were driven by the Zorvan's design. They were programmed to fight to the death. Zack wasn't sure how long he could keep this up. His breaths were coming faster now, his muscles aching from the effort. He could feel the weight of the Zorvan's challenge pressing down on him. This wasn't just about fighting for his life. It was about proving he was worthy to survive. He darted forward again, aiming for the next closest creature. But this time, something was different. There was a shift in the air, a strange sense of tension that he couldn't quite explain. The creatures stopped moving for a brief moment, as if sensing something had changed. Then, without warning, a loud, deafening screech echoed through the chamber. The creatures turned, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Zack followed their gaze, and to his horror, he saw what they were all staring at. The Zorvans had entered the chamber. The final trial. Zack stood motionless, eyes locked on the Zorvans who now filled the doorway. The creatures, which had been viciously charging him just moments before, suddenly froze, their attention diverted away from him. Zack, still holding the jagged piece of metal in his hand, could feel the sharp edge digging into his palm as he gripped it tightly. The Zorvan's leader, the towering figure with glowing golden eyes, stepped forward, his presence casting a shadow over the chamber. His gaze was cold, calculating, and unfazed by the chaos around him. The Zorvans moved with a synchronized fluidity that made them seem more like one entity than a group of individuals. The leader's voice rang out, powerful and calm, as though he were speaking to an audience instead of a single human survivor. "Well done, human," the leader said, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "You have proven yourself capable of surviving the creatures we've unleashed upon you." But that was only the beginning. Zack's chest tightened. He wasn't done yet. That was just a warm-up. The leader continued, unfazed by Zack's nervousness. "The true test is not physical strength alone. No, human. Your real challenge lies ahead. Only those who can prove their mental strength, their ability to think beyond survival, will make it out alive." The creatures surrounding Zack, still hissing and clicking, seemed to be waiting for orders. The leader raised a hand, and immediately the creatures retreated to the corners of the room, their glowing eyes fixed on Zack. Zack's mind raced as he tried to prepare for whatever came next. The Zorvans had never shown any mercy before, and he knew better than to think this was some kind of trick. It was their game, and he was just a pawn in it. The leader motioned for Zack to follow him, and without a word, the doors to the chamber slid open. Zack didn't hesitate. He had no choice but to follow. His body still ached from the battle, but his determination had only grown stronger. He was going to survive this. He had to. They moved down another long corridor, the walls now shifting and changing as they went. Every turn seemed to bring them deeper into the Zorvan base, and Zack began to feel the oppressive weight of the place. It was as though the entire station was designed to test him, to push him to his limits. Finally, they reached a large circular room. The walls were lined with consoles, strange symbols, and pulsing lights. In the center stood a strange machine, nothing like Zack had ever seen before. Its surface was smooth and metallic, with strange energy emanating from its core. It hummed with an otherworldly power. "This is the final trial," the Zorvan leader announced, his voice echoing in the room. "You will face a choice, human. A choice that will decide the fate of your kind. If you succeed, you will earn the right to return to your people and warn them. If you fail, well, you will become part of the Zorvan's legacy." Zack's pulse quickened as he stepped closer to the machine, its dark energy drawing him in. The Zorvan leader's words echoed in his mind. A choice. What kind of choice? The machine hummed louder, almost as if it were alive. A screen flickered to life in front of Zack, displaying a series of cryptic symbols and images that he couldn't fully comprehend. But one thing was clear. Whatever decision he made here would have a monumental impact on humanity. Understand this, the Zorvan leader's voice cut through Zack's thoughts. You will either accept the Zorvan way, the path of the conqueror, or you will choose another way. The consequences of your choice will be irreversible. Zack took a deep breath, his mind racing. What was this machine? What did it want from him? Was it some kind of test of loyalty? Or was it something more sinister? Choose wisely, human, the Zorvan leader said. Your choice will shape the future of your species. Zack stepped forward, his gaze locked on the screen in front of him. It was like the machine was scanning him, reading his every thought, testing his very soul. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, the tension in the air suffocating. There were two options on the screen. One symbol was familiar, resembling a clenched fist, the symbol of the Zorvans, a representation of power and control. The other symbol was a complex array of intersecting lines, an abstract shape that didn't make sense to Zack, but felt strangely liberating. He thought back to everything he had learned about the Zorvans, their cold, calculating ways, their unyielding thirst for control. But then he remembered the people he fought for, the ones who were depending on him to make it out alive, the ones who didn't deserve to be ruled by alien overlords. His hand hovered over the controls. Every instinct told him to choose the path of resistance, to reject the Zorvans' ways and stand up for humanity's freedom. But what if choosing that path meant certain destruction? The Zorvans were ruthless. They wouldn't hesitate to wipe out anything that stood in their way. With a deep breath, Zack made his choice. His fingers moved quickly, pressing the symbol of resistance. The room went silent. The hum of the machine faded, and for a moment, Zack thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then, a low rumbling noise filled the chamber. The floor beneath his feet began to shake. The walls trembled. Something was happening. The Zorvan leader's eyes narrowed as the room shifted around them. You chose the wrong path, human, the leader said, his voice betraying a hint of anger. Now you will face the consequences. The machine behind Zack exploded into a burst of energy. A massive wave of energy shot out from it, shaking the entire room. Zack was thrown to the ground, his body slamming into the cold metal floor. The blast was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a force of pure destruction. But through the chaos, Zack realized something. The blast wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the Zorvans. Before he could react, the entire station shook violently. The Zorvans' base was beginning to collapse. The leader let out an enraged roar, but it was too late. The Zorvans had underestimated him. They had underestimated humanity's will to survive. Zack struggled to his feet, his mind racing. He had made the right choice. He had chosen the path of resistance. Now he had to survive the aftermath. The escape and the price of resistance. The room shook violently, and Zack felt the floor beneath him tremble. The explosion had rattled the entire chamber. The Zorvan leader, still standing, was staring at him with fury burning in his golden eyes. Zack's breath came in ragged gasps as he picked himself up off the floor. The shockwave had sent him sprawling, but his instincts pushed him to move, to act. The Zorvans might be powerful, but they weren't invincible. The explosion had caused a chain reaction in the Zorvan station. The walls were now visibly cracking, and the once imposing metallic floor began to buckle and groan under the immense pressure. The station was falling apart. But Zack couldn't afford to think about that for too long. He had made his choice, and now he needed to escape. The Zorvans might have underestimated him, but that didn't mean they were done with him. They would come after him. Fast. The Zorvan leader's voice rang out, sharp and full of venom. "You dare defy us, human." His words echoed throughout the collapsing chamber. "You have doomed your species to extinction." Zack didn't have time for a battle of words. He had no interest in hearing any more of the Zorvans' threats. His mind was focused on one thing: survival. The screen in front of him flickered, showing the countdown to the station's destruction. The blast had already initiated a self-destruct sequence, and now the station was on borrowed time. The Zorvans knew that too, but Zack had a window to escape. If he didn't take it, there would be no second chances. He turned on his heel and sprinted towards the nearest exit. The door slid open automatically, but there was no time to appreciate the small victories. His pulse pounded in his ears as he raced through the corridors, the sounds of explosions and rumbling from behind him growing louder. The walls of the station trembled with each passing second. The whole structure felt as though it were being torn apart piece by piece. Zack didn't stop running. He had no choice but to press forward. There was a chance, just a slim chance, that he could make it out alive. His footfalls echoed in the narrow hallways as he darted around corners and leaped over debris that was now scattered across the station. The path to the escape pods was still several levels away, but he had to keep going. There was no turning back now. As Zack pushed through a door that had barely remained intact, he found himself face to face with a pair of Zorvan soldiers. Their sleek, armored bodies moved with lethal precision, and their cold, calculating eyes locked on him instantly. Zack's heart skipped a beat. He was out of time. These soldiers weren't just armed. They were also genetically enhanced, far more dangerous than the creatures he had faced earlier. The fight would be brutal, and he didn't have much in the way of options. He couldn't afford to fight them head-on, not with the countdown ticking in the background, not with the station collapsing around him. He needed to outsmart them. In an instant, Zack dropped to the ground, sliding into a crouch just as one of the soldiers fired a blast at him. The beam missed by inches, burning through the air where his head had been a second earlier. Without hesitation, Zack leaped to his feet, grabbing a piece of loose metal from the floor and throwing it directly at the other soldier. The soldier staggered back as the sharp piece of debris sliced across its armored chest. It hissed in pain, but the distraction gave Zack the opening he needed. He dove forward, shoulder-checking the first soldier into the wall, knocking it off balance. The second soldier attempted to recover, but Zack was already on top of it. He grabbed its arm and twisted it, forcing it to the ground. The soldier struggled, its unnatural strength making it a challenge to subdue. But Zack was relentless. He knew that his survival depended on his ability to fight with everything he had. A second later, the soldier's body went limp, and Zack wasted no time. He grabbed a pulse rifle from the fallen Zorvan and bolted toward the exit. The sound of the countdown in the distance was growing louder now, closer. He was running out of time. Zack didn't dare look back as he sprinted toward the escape pods. Every step he took brought him closer to freedom, but also closer to the Zorvan's wrath. They would stop at nothing to bring him down. As he neared the docking bay, he could see the escape pods in the distance. The doors to one of them were already open, but it was surrounded by a group of Zorvans. This was his final obstacle. He had to get past them to survive. The pressure was mounting, and Zack could feel it. There was no other choice. He raised his pulse rifle, aimed at the nearest soldier, and fired. The beam struck its target, but it wasn't enough. The Zorvans were too many, too well-armed, and Zack knew he was too exposed. But just as all hope seemed lost, the ground beneath him rumbled again, harder this time. The entire station seemed to shudder as if it were going to collapse entirely. The Zorvans paused for a split second, distracted by the shaking, giving Zack the perfect moment to move. He fired again, his pulse rifle unleashing a series of blasts that forced the Zorvans to retreat into cover. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it bought him just enough time to dive into the escape pod. The doors slammed shut behind him as he hit the emergency launch button. The pod shook, and for a moment, Zack feared it was too late. The Zorvans would find him. They would catch him before he made it to safety. But then, with a sudden jolt, the pod shot away from the Zorvan station, blasting into the void of space. Zack gripped the sides of his seat, gasping for air as the station, now in full collapse, exploded behind him. A brilliant burst of light filled the view screen, and for a moment, Zack thought he had witnessed the end of everything. But he was alive, and humanity still had a chance. As the pod drifted into the unknown, Zack allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had made it. He had chosen the path of resistance, and now he would carry the message of defiance to his people. The Zorvans had underestimated humanity's will to survive, and Zack had just proven it. A new hope or a dark future. Zack's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the escape pod drifted silently through the vast emptiness of space. The shaking and rumbling of the Zorvan station's destruction still echoed in his ears, and he could feel the thrum of adrenaline pumping through his veins. The explosions, the blasts, the chaos, it all seemed so far away now. Yet, the weight of what he had just done pressed heavily on his chest. He had made it out alive. The Zorvans were gone, at least for now. But the question remained, what next? The pod's sensors beeped, indicating that it was still in the middle of its journey, heading toward an uncharted area of space. Zack didn't know where he was going. The escape pod had no set destination. It was a last-ditch effort for survivors, meant to take you to safety after the worst was over. But for Zack, the worst wasn't over. The Zorvans had learned the hard way that he wasn't a pawn in their game. Now he had to figure out what to do next. His hands gripped the control panel in front of him. He could feel his muscles tense with every thought that raced through his mind. He had defied the Zorvans, and he had chosen humanity over everything else. But now that he was free, the enormity of his decision settled in. He hadn't just chosen resistance. He had chosen the unknown. He leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. The escape pod was equipped with basic life support systems, enough to sustain him until he found a way to make contact with Earth. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He had to trust that someone, anyone, was still out there, waiting to hear from him. As Zack activated the pod's communication system, he couldn't shake the feeling that the universe around him was watching. He had made a powerful enemy, but the Zorvans weren't the only ones watching. There were others out there, potential allies, perhaps, or new enemies, who had seen his defiance. He punched in the emergency frequency that had been provided to him, hoping beyond hope that Earth's communication channels had survived. A moment of silence passed before the screen flickered to life. It was a weak signal, a static-filled image, but it was a sign of life. Someone was out there. "Hello," Zack spoke, his voice breaking through the interference. "This is Zack Lawson. I survived. I've made it out of the Zorvan station. I need to talk to someone. Can anyone hear me?" For a moment, there was no response. Zack's heart raced. Was this all for nothing? Had his transmission been lost? Had Earth given up on him? But then, the static cleared just enough for a voice to cut through. "Zack Lawson, is it really you?" The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was Sarah, one of the leaders of the resistance. A feeling of relief washed over Zack. She was alive. Humanity hadn't forgotten him. "Sarah," Zack breathed, relief evident in his voice. "I survived. I've made it out of the Zorvan station. They're gone, but I don't know where to go next." There was a brief pause on the other end. Sarah's voice came back, stronger this time, though still tinged with static. "We've been monitoring the Zorvan's movements. The news of the station's destruction is spreading, and there are some of us left. We've set up a safe zone, a place for survivors to regroup. You're not alone, Zach. There's still hope, but it's going to take time. The war isn't over. Zach let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. There was still hope. Humanity had not given up. I don't care how long it takes, Zach replied, his voice determined. I'll get there. I'll warn them. I'll let them know what the Zorvans really are. You'll get there, Sarah reassured him. But first, you need to lay low. Stay hidden for now. The Zorvans are ruthless, and they're looking for survivors. They'll stop at nothing to wipe us out. Zach nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Understood. I'll keep my head down. Just tell me where to go. There was a pause before Sarah gave him the coordinates for the safe zone. It was far, but it was his only option. As the transmission ended, Zach leaned back in his seat, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. He had just taken the first steps toward a much larger fight, one that would define humanity's future. But even as the weight of his responsibility began to settle on his shoulders, Zach couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The Zorvans had underestimated him, and now they would pay the price. But humanity's fight wasn't just against the Zorvans anymore. It was about survival, resistance, and the fight for freedom. As the pod hurtled through the darkness of space, Zach made a vow to himself. He would get to Earth. He would warn his people. And if the Zorvans were coming for them, they would know that they were no longer the only ones with power in the galaxy. Zach Lawson wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was the beginning of something greater.